In recognition of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, the Northborough 250th Revolution Committee was formed. As part of our commemoration, a series of short videos highlighting Northborough's role in the Revolution are being prepared. We hope you enjoy this series.
Hello everyone, we are Marie and Joe Wyman, and we're here today to tell you about the Knox Trail.
In June of 1775, George Washington was appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army by the Congress. He immediately traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to assess the needs of the Army, which was trying to defend Boston from the British. Washington concluded that he could not defend Boston without more artillery. The fledgling army was in desperate need of various size cannons, mortars, and gunpowder. While in Cambridge, Washington met with a civilian friend named Henry Knox. He was a young man whose engineering abilities had previously attracted Washington's attention. Knox had studied gunnery and fortification building by reading books he obtained from London, England, for British soldiers. He owned a bookstore in Boston called the London Bookshop, but had to abandon it and travel to Worcester after the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. He later returned to help the Army reinforce the heights around Boston, which included a magnificent fort on Roxbury's old Fort Hill. The deed drew the praise of Washington and several other Army officers.
Due to Knox's success, Washington gave him the task of traveling to New York to obtain as many cannons as possible from Fort Ticonderoga, which was now in American hands. He immediately prepared for the trip and left with his brother William on November 16, 1775. On November 25th, Knox learned from General Philip Schuyler in Albany, New York, that 60 tons of cannon were at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. He left Albany immediately and arrived at Fort George on the southern end of Lake George on December 4th. The next day, he sailed up Lake George and arrived at Fort Ticonderoga. Knox spent 4 days at Fort Ticonderoga and determined there were 59 cannons, mortars, howitzers, and boxes of lead. Knox's brother, William, along with additional men, took 10 days in very disagreeable weather to get back to Fort George with the artillery, using only manpower and 3 shallow draft sailing craft on Lake George. While this was happening, Knox was making arrangements with General Schuyler, who was an aristocrat of New York, to obtain 40 sleds and oxen to drag them.
Knox's prayers for snow were answered, but too much snow fell, causing him to revise his plan to use sleds and oxen. Instead, he obtained sleighs and horses to get from Fort George down to Albany. They had to cross the Hudson River 4 times, and the ice gave way twice, but they were able to retrieve several cannon from the shallow water and proceed. The column of cannon then miraculously moved across the mountains of western Massachusetts in very deep snow, using the teams of oxen Schuyler had provided. Once over the mountains, they continued the trip east using horses and wagons obtained from Massachusetts people. Knox's wagon train now steadily moved across Massachusetts, arriving in Framingham to await Washington's orders. The townspeople along the way gave the teamsters so loud a welcome that Knox would fire one of his mortars as a showing of gratitude. The people all knew the value of what was passing by in front of them, because the cannons would now help the army force the British out of Boston on Evacuation Day, March 17, 1776.
This historical marker, as I mentioned earlier, depicts the location of the wagon train of artillery as it passed along Main Street through the town of Northborough. Knox arrived in the Cambridge camp on January 18, 1776, a trip that had taken approximately 2 months to complete. He wasn't a civilian any longer, however. Congress had approved Washington's recommendation the previous November that made Knox a colonel the day after he left. He was given a commission to be the head of the Army's artillery regiment as well, and would later go on to become one of the most famous generals of our Revolutionary War.